So, welcome everyone. Thank you for making it here through the blizzard. We really appreciate it. I want to introduce a wonderful guest who very kindly made it through the snow to present his wonderful work to us. This is Professor Spencer Overton, who is Patricia Roberts Harris Research Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School. If you were here the last time Professor Overton gave a talk, then you would have noticed that Jane Birkin came out to say hello. And that is, because his work is so incredibly important. I'm really eager to hear about the new paper. Thank you so much for coming all the way and giving us this presentation.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today, for the invitation. I want to also thank Heather Branch, who was unable to be here today. Mikey McGovern, thanks for stepping in here, and Caleb Young for their help in pulling things together. And thanks to all of you who braved the weather to be here today, and those of you joining us online. Now, look forward to sharing some of my work with you, also learning from you. The working title of the paper that I'm presenting today is Ethnonationalism by Algorithm. It's the third in a series of law review articles I've been writing on the relationship between AI and multiracial democracy. The first article examined how AI can undermine multiracial democracy by structuring identity, opportunity, and voice. It analyzed how bias, homogenization, deception, manipulation can distort representation, suppress pluralism, and erode trust. It also warned that AI-driven surveillance and predictive analytics can facilitate demographic sorting, political targeting, and social exclusion. Tools that in fragile contexts can enable digital redlining, automate oppression, and engineer politics based on identity. Here, the core claim: without guardrails, AI infrastructure can advance ethnic conquest, assimilation, exclusion, and discrimination at scale. The second article, and these first two I talked about the last time I was here, second article assesses when AI can strengthen racially inclusive democracy by expanding participation, bridging polarization, improving government responsiveness. It explores how translation tools, community power building applications, civil rights compliance tools can reduce turnout, can reduce turnout gaps, can detect discrimination, and really facilitate democracy. So now I'm going to skip ahead to a fourth article in this series. I wrote it after I wrote the article I'll discuss today. I co-authored it with Danielle Keats Citron. The two of us did this together. It further develops the concept that I introduced in the paper that I'll discuss today. So that paper is Digital Ethnonationalism. Basically, the concept is the design and deployment of digital systems and policies in ways that embed racial, religious, and cultural hierarchy in the infrastructure of political life. So now, coming back to this article, the third article, it'll be out next month, early March here. This one focuses more directly on really kind of hard law and policy. This piece argues that AI is not simply a technical domain, it's become a central front in the political contest over the meaning of American democracy and identity. As I mentioned, this is in the Howard Law Journal. Part one of the paper, I trace how ethnonationalism has shaped U.S. law and policy, and how the second Trump administration has revived and extended this legacy. Now, let me just talk about what I mean when I talk about ethnonationalism. I'm talking about a political ideology that reserves democracy for members of a dominant racial, ethnic, or cultural group. while attempting to marginalize, exclude, or assimilate others. Ethnonationalism is not the same thing as ordinary patriotism, border control, or even cultural confidence. It's a theory of democratic membership. Who counts as the people? Whose voice is legitimate? Whose claims are treated as presumptively suspicious or disloyal? Now, what makes this moment that we're in right now different is that ethnonationalism is increasingly advanced, not only through explicit rules like immigration restrictions or school curriculum mandates, but through infrastructure, digital infrastructure that quietly shapes opportunity and voice. AI is especially useful for that project, particularly AI policy, because it translates contested value choices, Mikey, into technical language like neutrality, efficiency, and then scales those choices across institutions. Now, from the founding of the US here, ethnonationalism has shaped American law. Constitution, as we know, protected slavery. The federal government subsidized tribal conquest. The Naturalization Act of 1790 explicitly limited naturalized citizenship to, quote, free white persons. And this and later racially exclusionary immigration laws effectively gerrymandered our population to create racial democratic majorities that persist to this day here. There's much more, won't get into it, but just kind of wanted to go with that baseline. Now, a multiracial democracy began to emerge in the 1960s through transformative laws like the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration and Nationality Act. These reforms catalyzed demographic and political change by reducing discrimination in voting procedures and in immigration policy. In 1960, basically, people of color were 15% of the population. Today, they're over 40%. In 1960, people of color accounted for only 3% of the members of the US House. Today, they're at 28%. But this has triggered a backlash. Some Americans perceiving a loss of power and status kind of embraced white identity politics. Ashley Jardina has a good book on that by that name. We see a similar ethnic and nationalistic backlash in places like Germany with AfD, France with Le Pen, Hungary, Poland, other nations. Now, in the United States, the second Trump administration has taken this backlash to a new level. In its first year, it dismantled or defunded the Minority Business Development Agency, the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, the Digital Equity Broadband Program, and a variety of other equity programs. It directed the Smithsonian and the National Park Service to strip exhibits that acknowledge histories of slavery, indigenous dispossession, and systemic racism, framing such narratives as divisive and anti-American. It ordered the restoration of Confederate monuments and renamed military bases back to their Confederate designations and mandated that patriotic education be taught in federally funded schools while banning what it labeled discriminatory equity ideology. The Naval Academy purged from its library 381 titles on topics like the Holocaust, civil rights, racism, Black soldiers, and the killing of Trayvon Martin. Meanwhile, books like Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler remained in circulation. And then, of course, there's the immigration policy. We know that race and language have been markers to stop justifications, to stop people, and the Supreme Court has basically deferred to that for now. The administration suspended admissions of refugees, 95% of whom come from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but then carved out exceptions for white Afrikaner immigrants from South Africa. As you know, it sought to reinterpret the 14th Amendment to deny birthright citizenship to many children of non-citizens. That case is before the US Supreme Court now. The court interpreted Title VI to prohibit universities from giving scholarships to students enrolled in DACA. The administration rescinded requirements that agencies provide language assistance to individuals with limited English proficiency, and it asserted for the first time ever on a federal level that English is the nation's sole official language. Now, there's much more, right? But sometimes people talk about race and folks say, oh, you know, are you stretching things, that kind of thing. I just want to lay out that when I talk about ethno-nationalism, it's based on some concrete actions, some evidence here. This isn't a speculation piece. These actions, they're not isolated. They reflect a coherent political project to reassert cultural dominance, to marginalize pluralism, right? And to assert that ethnic diversity is no longer a public good. My point today is that these same principles also shape the administration's approach to AI governance. The move is not just a change in rhetoric, it's a shift in institutional design. AI governance in the federal government is increasingly built through executive orders, OMB memoranda, procurement rules, and technical standards that agencies and contractors treat as baseline requirements. These tools, these directives determine what gets bought, what gets deployed, what gets audited, what gets documented, right? Once those defaults are set, they persist through vendor ecosystems, contract renewals, agency templates, and standard operating procedures, often long after public attention moves on. So when the administration defines equity protections as ideological, it's not merely taking a position, it's changing the rules of the road for how government will operationalize AI across benefits, immigration, enforcement, public services, and a variety of other decisions here. Now, before turning to the Trump administration's AI policies, I think it's important to understand how AI that's unregulated can advance ethno-nationalist objectives, right? Now, in the context of AI, these harms stem from four well-documented features of unregulated AI: bias, homogenization, deception, and manipulation. Bias is the most visible. We all know about credit scoring, criminal justice risk assessments, hiring platforms, facial recognition that have been shown to discriminate against people of color. So I'll move on to homogenization. I think it's less appreciated, but equally serious. As you all know, many large language models function as averaging machines, optimizing for dominant patterns. The result is a suppression of dialects, an erasure of minority cultures, and a privileging of dominant narratives. US history shows how demands for conformity, whether it's boarding schools for Native children, corporal punishment for students who speak Spanish at school, bans on Black hairstyles that are natural, have been used to enforce assimilation. AI threatens to further flatten pluralism, right? Deception is another challenge. It often comes, as you all know, through synthetic content. Obviously, we saw earlier attempts in 2016 when Russian operatives ran fake Facebook pages posing as Black activists and saying, hey, let's boycott the election to suppress turnout. Generative AI obviously can take this to the new level, and there are a few instances of it that have already happened. Finally, unregulated AI can advance behavioral manipulation. In real time, chatbots can harness user data to engage in ways that reshape a user's beliefs, reinforce conspiracy theories, racial resentment, or civic disengagement here. Okay, So real harms in terms of unregulated AI. Unfortunately, on his very first day in office, President Trump rescinded federal guidelines that required agencies to mitigate algorithmic discrimination. 3 days later, he issued this executive order entitled Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. Rather than building on the prior anti-discrimination framework, this order repudiated it entirely. It declared America's priority to be, quote, sustaining global AI dominance, end of quote, and it instructed officials in agencies to eliminate any safeguards that might slow down development. It made no mention of discrimination, made no mention of equity or civil rights. Instead, it cast fairness requirements as, quote, ideological bias, end of quote, that was an obstacle to innovation. A few months later, April 2025, the Trump administration issued an executive order directing federal agencies to eliminate disparate impact liability to the maximum extent possible, characterizing it as an improper form of racial balancing. Agencies were instructed to reconsider pending investigations, consent decrees, and regulatory provisions that relied on disparate impact, and to explore federal preemption of state-level disparate impact protections. Now, while not limited to AI, this shift is especially consequential in the AI context. Disparate impact is the principal legal tool for identifying discrimination when intent is opaque or absent. AI systems typically operate, as you all know, through statistical correlations, proxies such as geography, education, language that can reproduce racial disparities without explicit racial classification. So in areas like border screening, aviation security, tax enforcement, credit underwriting, we can just go on. Algorithmic tools can appear facially neutral while generating unequal burdens that are detectable only in the aggregate. Without an outcome-focused framework, agencies lack a mechanism to test whether disparities are justified by legitimate objectives, right? And if they are, then they're fine. They don't need to be eliminated. But if they're not justified by legitimate objectives, this test pushes decision makers to look for alternatives. So I want to just spend another minute on this because I think that this is really important from a civil rights standpoint. Eliminating disparate impact insulates automated decision-making from scrutiny at precisely the moment government is scaling AI across high-stakes domains, right? It's not just like a narrow doctrine. It really makes discrimination much harder to prove and harder to remedy. If plaintiffs have to show intent, agencies and vendors can defend themselves by just pointing to neutral design choices, proprietary models, complex correlations that no one can fully explain. And because many AI systems operate through proxies here, discrimination can be real without intent. In practice, this rollback encourages a world where government can rely on black box tools, deny meaningful disclosure, and still claim legal compliance here. So in July 2025, the White House released another directive, an order entitled, quote, Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government. It condemns diversity, equity, and inclusion as an existential threat to trustworthy AI. It effectively prohibits government procurement, government purchasing, right, of systems that are fine-tuned to reduce algorithmic bias. To justify the shift, the Trump administration cited cultural grievances stemming from big tech's attempt to address their bias issues. So the background is that bias in algorithms has been prevalent. For example, Google's image recognition tool had significant problems with labeling Black people as gorillas. In light of this, in developing its AI chatbot Bard, a precursor to Gemini, Google attempted to fine-tune it to reduce bias, right? At one juncture, Bard created an image of George Washington that resembled Lin-Manuel Miranda's founding father, right? The image was George Washington who was Black. Now, even though Google immediately disabled and retrained its AI, this story was used as a political talking point to claim that AI fine-tuned to reduce bias was woke AI that created factual errors and was attempting to rewrite American history. So, as a result of the Trump executive order, fine-tuning AI so it is less biased here, so it doesn't discriminate. If you do that, that could effectively disqualify your company from federal contracts. Meanwhile, the government recently awarded a defense contract to Grok, a chatbot that recently referred to itself as an automated version of Hitler and disseminated anti-Semitic hate speech, right? Just as telling in the anti-woke EO here are omissions. Makes no mention of language access, despite AI's potential to provide low-cost, real-time translation to over 14 million Americans with limited English proficiency. The Trump anti-woke EO does not acknowledge algorithmic discrimination at all. In fact, the word discrimination is only used in this order to claim that, quote, DEI includes discrimination based on race. Moving on this past December, the administration issued an executive order titled Ensuring a National Policy Framework for Artificial Intelligence. So this was framed as an effort to prevent excessive state regulation, and it directs federal agencies to deter states from adopting or enforcing AI laws that the administration deems as burdensome. It authorizes the Attorney General to establish an AI litigation task force to challenge state AI statutes, and it instructs the Department of Commerce to identify onerous AI state laws. States that have such laws may be deemed ineligible for certain federal broadband funds and some other discretionary funds. The order specifically targets state efforts to address algorithmic discrimination, citing Colorado's requirement that developers exercise reasonable care to prevent reasonably foreseeable risks of discriminatory outcomes. It asserts that such laws may force models to embed, quote, ideological bias or generate false results to avoid disparate impact. Now, the claim misstates how Colorado's law works. Disparate impact does not require parity or false outputs. It provides a framework for identifying unjustified discriminatory effects in facially neutral systems. So the practical effect of this order is to pressure states to retreat from AI oversight, even as the federal government scales back its own civil rights enforcement. Now, Congress last year, before all this went down, rejected a broad moratorium on enforcing state AI laws, yet the executive order attempts to achieve a similar result, get to the same result in a backdoor way through threatened litigation and funding conditions. In combination with the administration's retreat from disparate impact enforcement, this order risks creating a regulatory vacuum in which high-stakes AI systems operate with diminished accountability. Bless you. So Trump's AI policies have been operationalized in agencies throughout the federal government. There are a variety of OMB memoranda that provide direction in terms of procurement. There are examples in individual agencies. The EEOC removed its 2023 guidance explaining how Title VII applies to algorithmic hiring tools. The Department of Labor withdrew requirements that federal contractors test AI tools for discriminatory outcomes in hiring, promotion, and termination. HUD rescinded safeguards against racially biased automated appraisal models and eliminated data reporting obligations needed to detect discriminatory valuations. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau abruptly revoked anti-bias protections that required creditors to provide specific and accurate explanations for algorithmic credit decisions. DOJ rescinded regulatory provisions that prohibited federally funded entities from engaging in unjustified practices with discriminatory effects, obviously limiting enforcement to intentional discrimination. And the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, rewrote cooperative research agreements, removed references to responsible AI. It deprioritized equity research. It abandoned efforts to benchmark model performance across race, gender, and income groups. Now, there's much more, many other agencies. These are just some examples. The cumulative effect is profound, right? This is a shift not just away, and just to say this, right? It's tough because, just as an academic, I really feel like I have to call it as I see it, right? And it's tough because, I don't want to be partisan, and this isn't a partisan issue. This is about a particular vision in terms of ethnonationalism, right? This is a shift not just away from Biden's AI policy, but from President Trump's first term. In 2020, President Trump signed the AI in Government Act, which directed OMB to provide best practices for agencies for mitigating AI bias, right? Also in 2020, President Trump issued an executive order directing agencies to ensure their AI use complied with civil rights laws, right? So we've got to recognize that this is really different in kind, not just degree here. We also, though, have to prepare for another path in the future to shape where we're going. Another policy path that embraces pluralism and ensures new technologies reflect the full diversity of the American people. To address these problems statutorily and prevent a future administration from engaging in similar policies, I propose an Equitable AI in Government Act to be passed by state and local governments now and by the federal government when the political environment is right. This act would prohibit federal agencies and contractors from using facial recognition unless it's been empirically validated as non-discriminatory. The act bars government use of AI for psychological profiling, micro-targeting, or adaptive persuasion without independent review, disclosure, and consent. And for high-risk uses, including employment, housing, healthcare, credit, law enforcement, voting, the act requires independent audits, operational testing, annual impact reviews, and guaranteed rights to human review and oversight here, right? So one reason I start with government here, because I appreciate the fact that this isn't going to deal with discrimination in the private sector and some of the problems in the private sector. But one reason that I start with government is just leverage and legitimacy. Procurement rules are not just internal housekeeping. They set market expectations. They shape vendor design choices. They establish what counts as a reasonable practice when private actors deploy similar systems. Government has a distinctive duty. It shouldn't treat the public as a market segment. It shouldn't treat exclusion as a tolerable externality of innovation. If we treat AI governance as a question of democratic membership, who is seen, who's served, who's respected, right? Then the work is not some optional ethics type of thing, but it's core and enforceable law, right? So to close, I want to just return to this broader frame. We're living through a moment of profound demographic change and technological transformation, not just in the US, but globally. Ethnonationalism offers one path, defining belonging narrowly, using AI as a tool of exclusion, but there's another path that's possible, one that embraces pluralism, builds durable democratic institutions, and ensures that new technologies reflect the full diversity of the nation's population. So that's the project of reimagining AI law as central to an inclusive democracy. So thanks y'all for engaging in this work, and I look forward to our discussion. Mikey.
Great, thanks so much, Spencer. I have many questions, but I'm gonna ask one just to get things going in the room. So there's, and this is inspired, I think, by some current events. So right now there's this spat between Pete Hegseth and Anthropic, right? Because he's accusing Anthropic of, implementing all kinds of nefarious woke AI, and wants, to get the good stuff.
Right.
Right. I'm not sure what he's asking for exactly. But what it raises is kind of like this sort of conflict in enforcing these laws, which is that a lot of the time it is the agencies operating through procurement and contracting rather than being able to work directly with vendors and hold the vendors directly liable. So I appreciate some of the things you're saying about, the ways in which procurement rules, set reasonable practices, and market choices can drive things at this particular moment in time. But my question is just looking at this spat, does this tell us that the federal government of the United States is in a relative position of strength or weakness regarding the direction of the AI industry and best practices? All the executive orders you show, I do the history of AI regulation, and I feel like everything was blowing up my job talks.
Right.
So I had to end with this stuff, and I was like, what do we say about this? It makes us feel, a little bit better. And I guess what I hit upon, maybe it's kind of premature, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is that, a lot of the strength of this language and the executive orders, and just the real, it's almost, it functions as on a discursive level, right? It's we're telling you don't do this, is sort of the government almost acknowledging that it's in a fairly weak bargaining position with respect to an industry that has absorbed norms from practitioners, from conversations that have happened over the course of decades and have just kind of become part of the fabric and practice of American life, at least, and, sort of global citizenship more broadly. So I guess to what extent does this, is the government's bargaining position, are they able to actually do anything to the big vendors? And to what extent can the vendors kind of just go along and operate along the rules and the rule book that they've helped set up?
Right. So thanks for the question, Mikey. So on one hand, there is this element of weakness, right? I think I cited in the paper, maybe only about 4 or 5% of spending in the country, in the US, comes from the federal government in terms of AI spending. The vast bulk is private sector. And so it's not a situation where the government dominates here. On the other hand, I do think that the power of the government to say, we'll investigate you, we'll, use the IRS, or we'll use all these other devices to make life difficult for you if you don't get with our program, is a problem. Mikey, I I am not a believer in the notion that there is a neutral AI. One of the reasons that I say we should embrace pluralism, and I'm kind of affirmative about these values, is I think that there's a different way than what I call kind of this ethnonationalist way here, right? And so I think we have to be affirmative about that. And so even though politics may change in the future, my hope is to statutorily embed this. So it's very difficult to deviate from a pluralistic a vision of the law. And so I think the point is, I think that there's a mixed bag on this in terms of, yeah, there's some weaknesses of the federal government, there's some strengths of the federal government, but I hope, whatever you think about what I've said, I hope you walk away from this with the notion that this is a concerted effort to embed a particular cultural perspective into our government and into technology, and to pressure the private sector to go along with that. And we need to just acknowledge that, call it out, and say that there's a different way, right? Now, I don't know if that's responsive. If not completely, just please push back, anybody here. Yes, Chinmay.
Thank you for the spectacular presentation. I've sort of jumped the gun because I haven't fully formed my question yet. I'm going to do my best. So I see why you're going with the statutory route, given what's been coming out of the Supreme Court these days. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering whether you also think that parts of the kinds of arm twisting, if I may use the term, that the federal government is engaged in are right for the Supreme Court case. For example, telling a platform what kind of content it can display or not seems to me like it might violate the Constitution a little bit. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether that's also one route to prevent the state from pushing all of the AI companies towards a single vision. So that's one question. Mm-hmm. And then the second, maybe it's naive, and I think that this situation hasn't come up in this country in many years. But I just, when I think of the tech company CEOs, they all seem to me like people that are not actually geographically tied to any place. And so I'm wondering whether there's also an emerging undercurrent of they might actually, mm-hmm. if they fear.
Yep. Right. Statute versus a court case here, litigation, right? I think litigation definitely is a constructive tool, and, there could be some First Amendment issues, certainly with regard to these states and the notion of withholding federal funds if they enforce their own state laws. I think that like Phil Weiser in Colorado and other folks are thinking about challenging that. So I think that is, that's definitely an avenue. So full disclosure, totally see how the sausage is made. Like when all this was going on, I wrote this piece last May through August, right? And for me, it was, what is going on in terms of this criticism? Let's connect the dots in terms of this AI policy, right? But when you send things to law reviews, you got to have a solution, right? And so you got to have the solution for the students. So that, hey, what's the solution? And initially I thought, what's the big solution? But you got 25,000 words. And so, hey, let's kind of narrowly tailor it to the procurement context in terms of a solution. So, part of it was just the practical need in a law review article to not just document what's going on and connect it to an ideology here and observe that, but to provide a solution and move forward. I think here are the challenges that I see in terms of litigation. One challenge is that at least with regard to procurement, there are fewer First Amendment claims that can be made by a private actor because the government is requesting particular products here, right? So that's one thing here, right? I think it's one of the reasons why if government, in the future, if government says we want non-discriminatory AI and we want you to do all this testing, vendors won't just be able to say, hey, it's my First Amendment right. I shouldn't have to do that to get a contract, right? So that's one issue. I think the other issue is, I'm kind of focused on three big issues. This is one. What happens if the court scales back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is another, and thinking about proportional representation. And the third question I'm thinking a lot about is this Supreme Court equipped to deal with a multiracial democracy, right? Is the composition of the court such that it can deal with the challenges of how you kind of keep together a very diverse, large, multiracial democracy here, questions about the court. So I do have some questions and some skepticism about the court, at least this court. And it comes from a lot of different directions and sources. One is the fact that Wyoming has, a voter in Wyoming has, over 60 times the power of a voter in California in the U.S. Senate. And the U.S. Senate is confirming these judges, is one of the issues. There's some structural issues, and then there's also some issues in terms of what we see going on with regard to civil rights law, right? So I always appreciate the fact that courts are important, and we want strong courts and independent courts. And I do have some questions about at least this court and the future of it, right? Yes.
I'm results.
Hey, how are you doing?
On the one hand, I wanted to ask, to what extent the language of the EOs is actually descriptively ethnonationalist? And then I on the kind of solution side, I was wondering if you feel like the two options are just pluralist versus ethnonationalist, or is pluralist really more of like the neutral view, or is there, because and I'm thinking with reference to how the Biden administration had written up, it was like a testament to the 14th Amendment and equal protection. And it was, lots of very florid language about diversity in workers' protections, equality, whatever. And it's unclear to me that had any effect on what the labs actually did. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if the language like A actually reflects ethnonationalism, or if it even matters, and if there's some neutral way to present this very sensible solution that doesn't come across, like it's a left-right dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. I'll respond, and then I'll also come back to geography. I realized I missed that. I'm sorry. So I think that the language is ethno-nationalist, and here's why. If you look at remarks by J.D. Vance and Elon Musk to entities like AFD and others, right? The mirroring of, we don't need to be ashamed of the past here. We need to move on. This is discriminating against us in our culture, etc. It's not a caricature or a cartoon, right? It's not some, hey, we're just evil KKK people. It is, we have a vision in terms of our culture and who we are, and we need to protect that. And it is being, it's under assault right now, and we need to preserve it. And one of the reasons I use the term ethno-nationalism is that race is like just too loaded, or racism or whatever. I really felt ethno-nationalism was much more descriptive in terms of what's going on now. That slide that I had with the America Legal First and AFD, et cetera. Originally, I had like a Confederate flag. I was like, that's too much, right? Like, that's not necessarily what's going on here in terms of this discrete ideology here, right? So I think by its very nature, the terms ethnonationalism presume, discrimination against this dominant culture, a kind of inverse upside down world where, hey, we're infringed upon and we have to assert ourselves here. So I would say when you look throughout and they push for neutrality and objective, and they frame diversity, equity, and inclusion as ideologically biased, right? It's an attempt to say those are the people who are biased. We're the objective folks here, right? So there's that. Now, I definitely think that there is a way to frame things, and I want to frame things in a way that's inclusive for everyone. To me, one of the major struggles of what do you do with FD or other entities is I believe that there's a place for everybody. And how do you include people who don't also believe there's a place for everybody, who want to kind of wipe you out? And so I think that that's something conceptually we're, still struggling with, right? Like in a multiracial, pluralistic democracy, how do you include and provide real status to those people who don't believe in that system or that belief at all? Kind of like, how do you provide for free speech for those who believe we need to get rid of the First Amendment or free speech that is there, right? I think one of the reasons I wanted to lean into this is I didn't want to pretend, hey, I'm the one that's neutral and I'm above these other folks. I wanted to really kind of lean into a pluralist vision. Now, again, my pluralist vision isn't necessarily reparative vision, right? It's not saying, hey, we got to have reparations or we've got to make everything even and look only at history and interpreting the present. It's not that, right? But I do think it's important to, I think my fear with just falling into the kind of color blindness, everybody is the same uniformity trap, is that there's a certain assimilation that denies difference and different perspectives. And I'm uncomfortable with that because of what we've just seen in terms of the history of that. And so perhaps there is a way to, some of the other pieces that I've written that you saw up here, I didn't use the term multiracial democracy ever in the title because I wanted it to be inclusive, right? Racially inclusive democracy, overcoming racial harms, et cetera, right? So I appreciate the fact that some words may be alienating, like multiracial democracy, or people may not know what that means. And I don't want to alienate people unnecessarily or impose just my vision upon them completely here, right? But I also just don't want to back down and back away in terms of that. Now, that kind of goes to the ethno-nationalist piece. You mentioned one other thing as well, and I'm sorry, I just was really focused on that. What was that one other thing you mentioned?
Well, I mean, I guess, would you be content with what the Biden admin had put out, and do you feel like that was sufficient to actually affect the behavior of that?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of, I think there was a lot of good bias stuff, right? I don't know that it always, I think it had a lot of exceptions in terms of law enforcement that need to be reconsidered. I think it focused largely on bias. I don't think it adequately dealt with homogenization and in terms of the pluralism issue that I've identified. I don't think that it adequately dealt with behavioral manipulation with deception issues. It had a few initial sprinkles of like the Commerce Department shall look into this or whatever to address those. But I think it focused very significantly on bias. And I think these other issues are challenges. I think it's the most significant thing that's been done on a federal level, which is good and significant. And I think maybe because the Biden administration leaned in on this, kind of the Trump administration in terms of disavowing the Biden administration was, said, let's just rip up everything that they've done here, right? Like, so that may have caused that. But, one thing I say, and I used to run a Black think tank, we met a lot with then Facebook during their audit, leadership conference, a variety of civil rights groups, right? And, the tech companies would say, okay, we got to listen to you, but we also have to listen to the conservatives. It's like, we're civil rights people, right? Like it's not like the civil rights people over here and the conservatives over here. Yeah, exactly. Like that's not the paradigm we're talking about. Civil rights is like for everybody in terms of Republicans, Democrats, is not like a partisan issue. So I think my point with stopping and distinguishing some of this stuff from Trump's last term was to say, this isn't just a partisan issue here. It's not a partisan issue. This is about kind of ethnonationalism, who's included in ideology. And certainly they're using in the political process to advance those ideals, but we shouldn't accept a political spectrum of limited government, a lot of government, and that the acceptance of discrimination is fine on the limited government spectrum. It's not necessarily associated with that. So I think I just kind of pushed back a little bit on that. In terms of geography, there may be a concern about flight. Obviously, we saw from California to Texas in terms of Musk, et cetera, and states kind of have this race to the bottom with regard to technology. I think that, there's certain things that we've got to balance, Chinmayi. I don't know if I mentioned this before when we've talked, but I never really got the Derek Bell space traders story here. I thought it was a cool science fiction thing, but I was like, okay, space traders, that kind of thing. And you remember that's the story where aliens come down to Earth and they say, we'll give you all the gold and health and environmental resources, and all you have to do is give us your Black people here. And there's a vote, and people vote to let the Black people go, and the Black people go with the aliens, and they get all this good stuff. And I said, this is interesting, but is it really relevant, right, to anything, right? There was a big tech leader who said, maybe about 2 years ago, people are concerned about all these costs, but we can't afford not to move forward with AI because of all the healthcare and all these wonderful things that will come from it, right? And I think that question is separate from the distribution of the costs and the externalities, right? I think we got to grapple with this question of how do we distribute the costs and how do we ensure that we don't externalize these costs onto communities who are not, situated to bear those costs here. And so I say all that to say, yeah, this fear may be legitimate, the AI arms race may be legitimate, et cetera, but we can't just accept costs here. We've got to figure out a way to mitigate the costs. I'm sorry to go on here.
Any questions? Otherwise, we could stop here.
Okay.
So that's
We have optional time. We can stop here or.
I wanted to just continue that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have two questions. So first, I'm researching about regulatory AI sandbox, and a huge challenge is how you script these principles. Let's say we have a scenario where this become a real political agenda, and
Right.
it's now law mandatory. So how you inscription these principles in actually code, because it's easier to understand the bias when the product
Right.
is already in the market
Yep.
than before. So look, why I'm asking this, because when we are talking with tech workers, that is the main concern.
Mhm.
They say, policymakers, they make these utopian perspectives about society,
Right.
then we have to actually think about it. And the
Right.
second is connected with this. So how a scholarly contribution like that becomes a real political agenda? I mean, that can shift the situation. Do you think there is some state or municipality that would be like the laboratory to try to make a pioneering kind of law for this? Which one would be?
Mhm.
Or do you think outside the US, the famous Brussels effect could be
Mhm.
some influence
Mhm.
inside the US? And finally, the opposite of the Brussels effects, the China ghost,
Mhm.
they were going to say, oh, this is going to cost money. And if we start, it's really interesting how they shape the
Right.
imaginary of competition. So they will say, okay, that's nice, but China's not doing this and they're going to win the race.
Mhm. So let me just start off with, I'm not a computer science or technical person. I'm a lawyer here, so I don't know exactly how, right? Kind of the things that are on my mind would be audits, impact assessments, like tools, regulatory tools and disclosure, so that we can understand when there's a problem, so that technical folks can kind of make some modifications in terms of things. I will say, I think that, the computer science literature I've seen, computer scientists are farther along. They recognize the pluralism problem in terms of LLMs and are trying to deal with it here. And I don't think that law folks or democracy folks have kind of adequately made the connection between the pluralism problem in these tools and the threat to pluralism in terms of democracy here. So I think that people are starting to figure out kind of technical solutions, and that is, beyond my competence here. But I do think that legal protections can help push back technical folks here to kind of rethink things here. States and municipalities need to play a role in terms of exploration, which is why these penalties on states that regulate AI that's a problem, right? So I do believe, the Colorado, New York, California, various places can and should have an effect. And I think it's a Brussels effect in terms of both places like the EU, but then also localities that can engage in regulation that can hopefully shape norms. I do think, as you've flagged, this China effect is real and is out there, but we just can't have a race to the bottom for immediate gratification. And I think the point of my voice and some other voices is to push back on that. And frankly, I would say the point for me of the law is to say that markets don't have all the answers and that we don't need to focus only on markets. Markets are important, but sometimes there need to be legal guardrails because, markets don't embody all important values, right? Mikey?
Yeah, I have one quick question, hopefully to wrap us up here. But just in the course of listening to your responses to people, I've been kind of wondering, in one way, and I think this might be getting ahead to your next article with digital ethnonationalism and the ways in which elements of an ideology kind of help reinforce the whole. But sometimes it actually almost seems like the case you're presenting is for algorithms by ethnonationalism. if in a certain sense. So like, and I say this because, we look at, maybe just to point to, an anecdotal example, certain, quote unquote, populist politicians who were previously in favor of regulating big tech, like J.D. Vance declaring that, Lena Khan was the only person in the Biden administration that he liked. These people are all seemingly really willing to compromise on this sort of, whatever kind of antitrust values or anti kind of big tech messaging that works with their base on the question of ethno-nationalism, whether it is a covert appeal to racial supremacy or an overt appeal to this idea of values and making America great again and whatnot. So part of me wonders okay, to what extent is dismantling racial inclusion useful for, creating this deregulatory federal AI policy rather than the other way around? Now, it doesn't have to be unidirectional, obviously. And that's how these things sustain one another. But it almost seems like this is kind of the tactical place where a lot of these folks are willing to say, okay, they'll say things about regulating big tech or about just letting, efficiency and removing guardrails, letting all that take its own course on this issue where they won't with others.
I agree with you. I think for me, this concept of growth and ethno-nationalism, I think that they can coexist here, right? I think that someone can be motivated by both ensuring that there are no guardrails as well as discard for certain communities or the notion that we want to advance particular cultural values that folks hold dear here. So I think that a lot of these things can coexist at the same time. One really interesting thing about this is I think that there were so many Republican states that were against the state moratorium, in part because if you look at Texas and Florida, particularly with social media content regulation, et cetera, they wanted to regulate in this space to kind of advance their values. They were not anti-regulatory here. So I do think that there's kind of an axis, and the regulate versus non-regulate axis can sometimes be a little different than the kind of ethno-nationalist hate axis here. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sure.
Good question. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And I'm curious about your analysis. Is normally focusing on the US. But I'm curious, do you think such as East Asia countries or EU, they also have this kind of ethno-nationalist dynamics or manifest differently?
So I think that that's absolutely right. I think this is not just a U.S. issue, and it's frankly not even just a Europe issue. It exists in other parts of the world as well. For me, I think that the U.S. and the EU have a particular moral responsibility to deal with this problem because they are, because of their effect and their extraction of resources and other things from the rest of the world. And so I think I don't think they should just close their doors and basically say, hey, France for the French or America for the people who were here in 17, whatever, who were not enslaved people. So I think that this is a global challenge here. And on one hand, we have this difficult challenge of ethno-nationalism. We've got this linear notion that things are always just going to get better with regard to time in terms of people getting along and ethno-nationalism. I think the founders of this country assumed that there would be people who were corrupt, who would want power, and therefore they broke up. They had different branches. I think that the notion of individuals acquiring power and political power by isolating a group and othering groups, I don't think that that's limited in time. I think that that's an ongoing issue, the same way crime or corruption, et cetera, and that we have to build institutions to check that. And so for me, that is an emerging and growing issue in terms of the ethnonationalism piece, this digital piece and how that affects our digital policies and the technologies themselves is something we should acknowledge and not run away from, and understand the intersection of the two. And again, they're not, number one, they're not separate. Two, they're global, right? Three, they deal with digital sovereignty issues here. And then obviously, finally, there are questions about the global minority and global majority, and how the global majority can have a real voice in developing standards that will bind everyone, whether directly or through like the Brussels effect, right?
We take this opportunity to thank you for yet another brilliant.
No.
I just wish there were more people in the room.
No, it's good. Yep.
But I know that they will be grateful for the video.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.